Ben Habib, thank you for joining us. You're not going to team up with Zora Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn on their new party, no?
I suspect we're not politically, philosophically aligned.
I'm just wondering. You never know anymore. Look, first of all, let's talk about the idea of Islamophobia, okay? Because I mean, there's anti-Muslim hatred. And hating someone either for their religious belief, their ethnicity, that clearly unacceptable, clearly discrimination, clearly something that you and I and all of our audience would find wrong. Islamophobia, though, has become very. There's a word, it's a newly invented word, has basically been turned into, effectively, any criticism of Islam, the religion, the beliefs, clothing associated with, on any aspect of Islam, which means that you're into a very different territory, aren't you?
You are. I mean, the word itself means an irrational fear, doesn't it? Phobia is an irrational fear. So it's actually rubbishing in the first instance, anyone who may have legitimate criticism of the religion. And, we mustn't forget that at its heart, I think the biggest challenge that Islam faces right across the world, whether you're an Islamist, a fundamentalist, an extremist, or a moderate Muslim, one of the biggest challenges Islam faces is that the Quran is the word of God, as dictated to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, and it is therefore perfect. And it is beyond improvement. It is beyond argument. And I think that's why so many Muslims seek to ban criticism of the Quran and Islam, in effect, because they see it as a criticism of God. And that makes the religion particularly challenging, as I say, for those Muslims who want to live in a democratic society.
Indeed, exactly. Where criticism of, the royal family, the prime minister, any institution, any religion is part and parcel of our freedoms. Well, the government set up this anti-Muslim hate / Islamophobia definition working group back in March. Its final recommendations so far will not carry statutory power, but the Policy Exchange report, they have looked at the Centre for Media Monitoring. Now, they are part of the Muslim Council of Britain, and they are repeatedly, they say, trying to influence how the media is reporting events going on. So, for instance, they try to just criticise, talk to journalists and everything, and try to get them to downplay or ignore Islamist extremism, which is clearly the greatest terrorist threat, and we discussed that on the show yesterday. That they basically are trying to sort of get any criticism of anything to do with Islam sort of downplayed or deleted. And they say that this is having far too much influence, and journalists are giving into it, and no one should be having any dealings with these groups.
Well, absolutely right. This is the shutting down of free speech and the pursuit of a progressive discrimination-based ideology. A protective blanket being put around an ideology as opposed to around an immutable characteristic. The argument often made is that it would be racist to be critical of Islam because essentially it's an underlying form of racism. But of course, there's nothing immutable about one set of beliefs. They can change over time. And so by very definition, it's an inappropriate it's an inappropriate term.
Well, indeed, but again, the idea, again, the same with the unofficial, not really, but we do have it really, blasphemy law. Only one religion is getting that protection, but it's absolutely fine to mock or criticise or slate any other religion. But it's interesting that the Policy Exchange say this organisation, part of the Muslim Council of Britain, should not be engaged with or taken at face value by journalists, regulators, or anyone else. And they say that they'll get a new weapon, effectively, if we have this definition of Islamophobia, which basically stops any tenet of Islam, of any aspect of religion being criticised. Now, I absolutely criticise blasphemy law, absolutely criticise some of the, certainly some of the dress. I don't even like the head covering, absolutely not the face covering, which I think should be banned in this country, as it's banned in many other so-called, liberal countries in Europe. It's quite the norm. It's not a requirement in most Islamic countries, so therefore clearly not a key part of it. But also some of the teachings, you have a right to beat your wife, to rape your wife. I mean, this is, things. No, I think we should call that out, but that doesn't make me Islamophobic.
No, absolutely not. And in trying to give this kind of protective characteristic to Muslims, effectively but they're shutting down free speech. And this is a further progression of our erosion of rights to freedom. And freedom of speech, as we all know, is the cornerstone of democracy. If we can't challenge these things and have an open debate without actually everyone getting, they're throwing their toys out of the pram, for want of a better expression, then we are damaging our democracy terribly. And there can be no better example than, for example, the Batley School, the grammar school teacher who showed caricatures. All he did was circulate other people who'd created caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. Then 3.5 years on, he's still in hiding.
Yeah, and with his family.
And
by the way, no charges brought against anybody who made death threats against him and his family, as far as I'm aware.
Absolutely. And you put that in contrast to the Dean of Trinity College, who 2.5 years ago described to his congregation that Jesus Christ, the statue of Jesus Christ in the arms of Mary in St. Peter's looked a bit transgender-like, and that the wound on his chest from one of those, from a Roman spear looked like a vagina. And there was absolutely no outcry whatsoever from the Christian community. I think the congregation were in tears, and perhaps rightly so. But this chap is not fearing for his life. In fact, he kept his job. He may have even, I would have perhaps advocated he be sacked.
No, but that's the key difference, isn't it? I mean, and this is the thing. And again, this widening, and again, it's perfectly reasonable to criticise any institution. We had recently with the case of the man who's been convicted of, causing public disorder by burning a Quran. I don't think someone burning a Bible outside the American embassy, for instance, he was outside the Turkish embassy, would be prosecuted for the same crime.
No.
Frank, it's your property. You can destroy it how you want. I must read a statement from the Centre for Media Monitoring, who've been criticised in this policy exchange report, saying this report is nothing but a politically motivated hit job, riddled with inaccuracies, distortions and smears. It comes from an organisation that has long sought to influence our media into negatively framing British Muslims. We're not surprised they're upset as we call them out. It goes on much longer, but I think that's a fair summary of their statement. But I mean, they would say that, wouldn't they, I suppose, is what they're saying about policy exchange. And we could say the same back to them.
Absolutely. And what we mustn't forget, Julia, is that this is an extension of the whole move in favour of progressive discrimination, which is born out of the Equalities Act, which is anything other than equal, which puts a protective blanket around minorities in the country. Yeah. And it is deeply, deeply damaging to the fabric of British society because it sets aside the interests of the majority. And we've got to go to the root of all of this. We've got to repeal the Equalities Act and all the regulations and other obligations that have now foisted themselves on the public in general. We've got to go back to a system where everyone is equal and open to equal criticism and challenge. And the other thing, sorry, just very briefly, the other thing that I think creates real problems in our regulatory and legislative framework is the Human Rights Act, because that was the foundation on which the Equalities Act was then built. Yeah. And we've taken immigrants in as if they're British citizens under the Human Rights Act, and then we've given them special protection and promotion and celebrated them to the detriment of the majority. And all of this needs to stop right across the board.
OK. Ben Habib, thank you for joining us. Former Brexit Party MEP, is now leader of Advance UK. Tom Slater, just wondering, have you started your own political party yet? Because everyone has. Everyone has.
It's the done thing, isn't it? So maybe I should consider it, because why not? At some point, everyone will have their own political party and they'll just vote for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. No. We'll have a coalition. Yeah, exactly. What do you make of it? I mean, the definition of Islamophobia, again, it just goes so much further than, again, if someone is shouting at somebody or attacking someone or verbally threatening them or hurting someone because they are a Muslim, absolutely, I want that person prosecuted. It's an outrageous thing. But I walk past women in burqas all the time. I live in London. I don't go up to those women and say something or give them a dirty look or anything. I disapprove of it. I don't think it should be allowed in this country. I think it's an abomination. I'm not happy with it. That's where the law is. I would campaign to change the law rather than harass anybody in the street. But does that make me Islamophobic?
No, absolutely not. I mean, that's the whole point of having a free society, isn't it? Is that we can have out our differences and that we should trust that everyone is robust enough to have their views challenged. But for whatever reason, where British Muslims are concerned, there's this whole kind of industry, the supposed kind of anti-racist industry, which is saying that no, we should treat them differently, that they're not like British citizens like the rest of us, that they need to be force-fielded from
quite
criticism.
patronising, actually.
And it's kind of unique to this group to a certain extent. And it's
But is it ordinary people who are here who are Muslim? Is this what they're demanding, or is it just their leaders or the white sort of the hand class?
I think a lot of it is the hand wringers. I think the problem is that what you've got is a perverse alliance between a small, quite conservative hardline faction within British Muslims and the kind of hand-wringing liberals making very similar arguments. But in terms of this report and this Muslim Council of Britain Centre for Media Monitoring, I mean, it's worth pointing out the kind of things that they have been talking about as Islamophobia. I've had a few run-ins with them over the years. There was one report from a few years ago where they chastised the BBC because they did a report on an Iranian woman who was taking part in the anti-hijab protest, and they said that this gave a needlessly one-sided view of the hijab. There was another case in which they criticised a Joanna Lumley travel documentary because at one point she described one of the countries she was in as having a less strictly Islamic feel than other places that she had visited. So this is the kind of hyper-offence taking
and you know that often cases like the BBC and others will go, we'll be more careful, whereas you and I would go, do one.
No,
not
exactly.
Interested.
So let's not allow these kinds of ideas to restrict everyone's speech.
Absolutely. 11:35 is the time. Just to let you know, you already realise if you're watching us rather than listening to us, Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte have arrived. They got off the plane, obviously finished that fight. They didn't have a fight, but they leave a plane. They've been greeted by the Prince and Princess of Wales at RAF Northolt. They've been meeting shaking hands and the military and various other great and the good, and they are off now in their car to Windsor Castle, where they'll be meeting the King and the Queen, and there'll be more ceremony, of course, that state banquet at Windsor Castle tonight, although in between he's going to be speaking to Parliament around 4 o'clock. Also, the breaking news in the last half hour: junior doctors have voted in a ballot from the British Medical Association, their union, to strike. 90% support for that strike. So we'll see what happens there and the impact that is going to be. I'll tell you what's something now very clear: people will die as a result. That's what happens when there are fewer doctors on duty.